This is Committable. I'm Jesse Mangan, and for this episode, we're going to be talking about protection and advocacy organizations. And we're very fortunate to have with us here some of the advocates and attorneys from Disability Law Colorado. For introductions, how about we start with Emily? You want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and the type of work you do?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today. I'm Emily Harvey. I'm co-legal director at Disability Law Colorado. I've been doing civil rights work, mostly focused on disability rights for about 11 years. And I grew up with a disability and have a lot of family members with disabilities. So this is my passion work and near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And then how about Megan? You want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and the type of work you do?
Sure. So my name is Megan Baker. I'm an attorney at Disability Law Colorado. I've been working here now almost 8 years, and most of my work has centered on working with people in facilities, different types of facilities. Mostly for me, psychiatric hospitals, jails, prisons, those type of settings, but it could also include nursing homes and basically any facility that serves people with disabilities. I also do a lot of work with folks that have mental health concerns, and folks that interface with the criminal legal system and the mental health systems.
I think the scope of that is a great way to start because there are so many different types of facilities there. And I think maybe the general public doesn't even really know what a protection and advocacy organization is or the scope of the work they're doing. So, what is a protection and advocacy organization?
So the protection and advocacy system was created in the 1970s after Geraldo Rivera went into the Willowbrook State Home and Training School in New York and uncovered the squalid conditions that people were living in Willowbrook. They were unclothed, unfed. There was medical experimentation without any sort of consent from anyone, and they were just living in squalor, totally uncared for, and the staff to resident ratios were one to hundreds. Legislators had gone into Willowbrook previously and called it a snake pit, and nothing was done. And after the expose that Geraldo Rivera did, that spurred Congress to create the protection and advocacy system. So every state and U.S. territory has a PNA, and it's a condition of taking federal funds to serve people with disabilities to have a PNA in your state or territory. So we're the one for Colorado. And then there's also a Native American PNA that covers the Four Corners area.
So in putting this together, the federal government gave a few different sort of directives to protection and advocacy agencies of, your job is to protect the rights of people with disabilities, and some specific ways to do that, which also gave us some specific types of authority, access authority, which is unique from a lot of other organizations who may do similar work. So what that means is that as part of our charge to advocate for people and the rights of people with disabilities, we have the ability to monitor, which is that we can go into any facility that serves people with disabilities with only a couple of limitations. It has to be during regular hours, and we can't overly disrupt the programming or the facility operations. So we wouldn't go at 2 a.m. and demand that they lock everyone down or anything like that. But we can go into any facility. We have access to any part of the facility to which the people with disabilities have access. So their housing units, treatment areas, common spaces, outdoor spaces. And we also have a right to talk confidentially with anyone who wants to talk with us. It's always optional. But if folks want to talk to us, they have to provide us with a confidential space to do that. The other thing that sets us apart from other agencies is our ability to do investigations. So if we receive a report or a complaint about possible abuse or neglect involving a person with a disability, or if we learn through whatever means, if we have probable cause to believe that there's abuse or neglect happening, we can investigate those situations, and sometimes we can get access to records that typically wouldn't be accessible, such as facility, manuals, internal policies, personnel records, medical records of people who are now deceased, and things like that. And that's to help us, determine whether or not there was abuse and neglect and what should be done about it. So We also just do all other types of advocacy, legislation, individual advocacy, systemic advocacy across disabilities. So, you know, you don't have to have a certain disability or a certain diagnosis for us to work with you. And as we talked about before, kind of across settings. So from people in schools to the types of facilities I already mentioned, to everything from, you know, regional centers, both private facilities and, you know, public or state-run facilities. So yeah, it's a really broad charge, which is difficult. But what I think many of us like about it is that our job doesn't look the same ever from one day to the next, and there's a lot of different tools that we have to use.
Thank you. Jack, do you want to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and the type of work you do?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jack Johnson. I'm an attorney here at DLC, like Megan and Emily, but my role is as our public policy liaison. So I am responsible for kind of a two-way street, which is advocating on behalf of people with disabilities in mostly state government, but also working locally and with our kind of federal delegation and as kind of a resource for those lawmakers as part of this two-way street where our organization is full of attorneys who understand the law and the way it impacts people with disabilities. And so as legislators, you know, lawmakers have questions, being their door towards being able to connect them to people who live with a disability or legal experts in those fields to be able to talk about the way legislation may impact people with disabilities.
So every state and territory has their own protection and advocacy organization, but it sounds like you were set up and your authorities were established by federal law. What sort of position does that give you within a state? So a state is your purview, and you said you have investigation sort of authorities. What does that mean? Is that like, would you have the authority to supersede a state sort of department? If a state department is running a facility, does the federal law mean that you should be able to have access to that facility?
It does. We have access to any place that serves people with disabilities. So that can be a public school, that can be a private prison, it can be a nursing home, it can be a host home, a group home, all sorts of different settings, residential facilities for kids. So each state, because of that, because we have a very broad authority and very broad access and broad substantive areas in which we work, we have to come up with focus areas every year to try to prioritize where we can make a change. And we, every PNA does their own process and has public input to decide what issues they're going to work on. But we have really made a concerted effort to try to focus on systemic work that can change systems for lots of people, because we have a staff of 21 and we cover the entire state of Colorado. And we work in that, we do the monitoring, we do the investigations. We also do work in housing, employment, education, all sorts of different stuff. So there's a vast amount of work to do. And so every PNA has to look at their own state and the needs of the state and try to figure out where we can make the biggest impact with the power that we have as the PNA.
Jack, so you're working sort of as a policy liaison. How do you look at the work and learn from the work that your other colleagues are doing and sort of on the ground in the facilities, and you translate that into policy conversations?
Yeah, so, you know, as everything usually starts with either, you know, some type of intake that we get, so an individual person reaching out to us with a type of problem, um, usually an aggregate of a lot of people having a similar problem, or something through monitoring where we are investigating and monitoring and are identifying problems. And, you know, the first step is identify what the problems are. And then the next step is to identify what are the ways that we can solve that problem? And it's not always legislation. Sometimes it is just direct interaction with a state agency to get them to improve their processes, or you know, a private company who's serving people with disabilities to get them to improve what they're doing. Sometimes it's litigation, and you know, Emily and Megan can talk a lot about that. And we go to courts and ask courts to uphold existing laws. Sometimes, though, we see gaps in existing laws where people are not being, their rights aren't being respected, or they're not being appropriately served. And the reason for that has to do just usually to do something with a state law or a state agency acting in a certain way. And, maybe it's an inability to change because of the way the law is, or maybe it's an unwillingness to change because of, a variety of factors. And when that happens, we've decided that the best route to take to solve a problem is to look at the legislation. That then comes onto my plate, and I'm responsible for working through what does that look like to get a law passed? What does that mean for our agency to do that? And then kind of making the pitch to lawmakers and guiding that through the legislative process. But I would say most of the problems we solve without having to do that.
And you mentioned like the aggregate of complaints. So if one person were to file a complaint, and let's say they're in a facility somewhere, they think they shouldn't be there, they file a complaint, and nothing immediately happens. I mean, I can imagine that could be disheartening for that individual, but it sounds like what you're saying is you're tracking trends. So that one complaint, in addition to others of the same thing, gives you the probable cause for an investigation. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and we will also try to serve that individual, whether it's individual advocacy tools for them to, advocate for themselves, or individual legal representation, which can occur. But it doesn't, even an individual problem can rise to a legislative fix, but typically we try to gauge the scope of that problem before, to change the law and invest not only our organization, but, state lawmakers and state resources. It takes a lot to change the law, and it impacts a lot of people. And so before we venture down that route, we look at trends both, on our intake side and on our monitoring side, and nationally. I mean, what are other PNAs seeing in their states? What is the federal government doing related to the rights of individuals with disabilities and how they're serving them? And among all those trends, set priorities based on a lot of factors for our legislation, including like urgency and impact, and how many people it will impact and how big that impact is.
So laws, especially like state and federal laws, they can be interpreted a lot of different ways. So sometimes a law that seems sound on a very practical, dry reading might get interpreted in a way that creates problems. Um, how much of the work that you do is refining interpretation? Like if you go to a facility, you might have staff there who were just trained in the wrong way, and maybe they actually have the best of intentions, but they're implementing in a way that's creating problems. How much of the work is sort of becoming almost a translator, interpreting that law, going to a facility and recommending, hey, I think you're interpreting this wrong, you're training staff wrong.
I think we've done a fair amount of that, and I'll let Megan speak to this as well. But we've gone into a youth facility where there was a misunderstanding about how medications were being reduced or completely stopped based on some other factors. And we spoke with leadership of that organization or that entity, and they revised their policy to clarify language and retrained all their staff so that they were no longer just stopping kids that were on meds based on factors that shouldn't have been, resulting in them being stopped cold turkey from those meds. So, but I think Megan also probably has some examples.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I think that there are a few different buckets here. I think that the first sort of low-hanging fruit, right, is we go to a facility and they don't know what the law is. I can think of a trip to a prison where sort of like, have you heard of the ADA? Let me explain it to you. A lot of times we are dealing with very well-known, long-standing federal law. So we do a lot of sort of informal education advocacy and, working with administrations at that level. I think there's another level that's sort of, there is a law, especially with state law, there is something that seems like it relates, or they think it relates, or we do, but it's unclear, how it's interpreted. And I think depending on sort of the intent and the outcome, sometimes we can resolve those issues without legislation. I think, though, there are also definitely other times where just there's one state-run program that sort of explicitly in statute says if you have this type of disability or if you're disabled in that kind of way, you're not eligible for this program. And so with that one, even though the intent might be there to follow, it's like, let's go ahead and change that. That's an explicitly illegal statement in state law. And I think by the same token, there have been times, that we've written laws or that we've been involved in passing laws that then a few years later you see, oh, there's some unintended consequence, or we thought this meaning was very clear when we said no, X or Y, that it seemed very clear to everyone involved at the time. But then it becomes unclear once people start implementing it. So there's kind of a whole spectrum, I think, of issues. But a lot of our work, I think, is looking at where there is existing law and how do we bridge it with what's happening on the ground.
With the monitoring aspect of your duties, is that something that only happens when there is a specific complaint filed, or is that a regular thing? Do you have like a regular sort of rounds that someone might be doing to visit certain facilities?
Yeah, I can answer that and then anyone else can jump in. It's both. I mean, the short answer is no. We don't have to have a complaint. If we have a complaint, we don't have to tell them why, we're here because we got a complaint that you're stopping people's medication. Um, Practically speaking, I when I first started this job, tried to count like the number of facilities in Colorado, and it's easily in the thousands. I mean, we have 21 prisons, 10 or 11 youth detention facilities, 57 county jails, two state psychiatric hospitals. So with the staff that we have, it would be great to just say, let's just put all of these on a regular rotation. And we've started doing that more. So we make more of an effort to, okay, we need to get to a few nursing homes. We need to go to a few jails. But in order to prioritize our work, we do definitely also take into consideration concerns and complaints. And the other thing is sort of the nature or severity. So if we get a call, and this has happened at times, X facility is not providing any medical care, and there are people sitting in their own feces screaming 24 hours a day. Or there are people that are chained to beds 24 hours a day for weeks on end. We'll prioritize, like, we can turn on a dime and go someplace. There are other complaints, the food isn't very nutritious, the staff are kind of rude, that maybe are not immediate.
People might not be thinking of thousands of facilities in their state, like depending on the side of the state, but thousands of facilities might catch you off guard. How do you maintain the resources to provide that scope? I mean, it's immense. You can't have a person doing every facility. So where do the resources come from? Maybe we'll start there. Where does the funding to maintain disability law Colorado specifically, where's that funding coming from, and how are you keeping the resources necessary available?
I think that at least historically, 90 to 95% of our funding has come from Congress, from the federal budget. So the protection and advocacy statutes talk about funding. And so we get funding through the budget that they're working on right now. And some P&As have more private donations, attorneys' fees from lawsuits, other sources of funding, up to P&As that 100% have always been fully funded by the federal funds. So they've never done private fundraising. So we have heavily relied on that federal funding to do this work. And we're hoping that that continues, but we're also exploring, ways to fund ourselves and to continue this work, because whatever happens with the funding, the P&A statutes will continue to exist and we'll still have this authority. It's just a matter of paying staff.
So Congress appropriates the funds, and then is it SAMHSA that would then distribute it to all of the various P&As?
So SAMHSA is they cover the protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness is what the statute is called. So the PAMI funding is through SAMHSA. Some of our other grants are through Department of Education. Some of them are through the Administration for Community Living. So they kind of flow through different paths.
And for each of these grants coming from different sources, they all have specific purposes, I'm imagining. So you have to track this grant is specifically for these things. Like you have to be tracking all of that, right?
Yeah. So the first PNA statute was PAD, the Protection and Advocacy for Developmental Disabilities. And then we have PAMI. We also have PAIR, which is the IR is individual rights. It's for people who do not qualify under the developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities categories. But we also have grants specific to voting rights, specific to using assistive technology, specific to traumatic brain injury, as well as the Client Assistance Program, which specifically helps people with the vision of vocational rehabilitation if they're having challenges navigating that system. The Protection and Advocacy for Beneficiaries of Social Security, which is specifically for people who receive Social Security benefits who have barriers to employment. So that money can only be used for that purpose. And then our representative payee program, which investigates people who manage Social Security funds for other people to make sure there's no fraud, waste, or abuse. And some of those come through SSA, some through ACL, some through SAMHSA. So yes, it's a lot to keep track of and a lot to manage, and we have to make sure we're using our funds for the purpose that they're intended. And they all each have their own reporting system back to the federal government. So we have annual reports that we have to complete that are requiring similar but not exactly the same data for the different grants. So we have to make sure that we're keeping good records to be able to be accountable to those different entities for the different grants.
Jack, I understand you've got a very busy day and other meetings to go to. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave us with about the legislative work, the policy work for Disability Law Colorado?
Sure. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I would just say that kind of to wrap up our legislative work, the thing that has been really important to us has been, I think we've grown our presence as we've seen the state legislatures becoming more and more important when it comes to protecting the rights of people with disabilities. And among the PNAs, every PNA does almost everything a little bit different, and legislation is no exception. But our work has been, I think, really important in recent years because of a shifting landscape where our state is taking more of a role when it comes to the rights of those individuals. And at the same time, you know, our work is really guided by people in the community, and we work a lot with other community partners. I would say legislation, more than anything else, is where we build these broad coalitions where we're working with organizations kind of across the disability spectrum, but across all kinds of other areas of interest of people who are impacted by the work that we do. And we have been, not everyone would agree with me, but we've been really fortunate to have, I think, members of both the state legislature, but also the state executive branch. And that ecosystem has made us successful, but not, I don't think we take that success for granted. And so it is, really important that our PNA network continues to seize on this moment that we have to continue to build on those rights.
So one of the things that I was just thinking about as you're talking about the community and all the different sort of stakeholders in these processes, it is always the individual going through the system that's their safety, their dignity, their humanity is the priority. But I imagine you're also getting a lot of input from sort of people within facilities, within the systems who see things and report it. And I know like with Willowbrook, Geraldo Rivera didn't just show up on a whim. Someone had told him he should come look at it. So I'm wondering what sort of protections are in place for the people who are witnessing something in a facility. Maybe they work at the facility. What sort of protections are in place for them if they report something to a PNA like Disability Law Colorado?
I can say that the PNA can take information from anonymous sources. So someone who works in a facility that notices something can report that to us without disclosing their identity. That's not to say that the facility couldn't figure out who did it based on the circumstances, but they're legally protected from retaliation for trying to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities. And I know there are other complaint processes that you do have to disclose your identity, but the P&A system is not one of them. So that is one protection that's in place.
Yeah, I just to add on to that a little bit, I think that's the main one is that there's nothing in our laws. I can't think of a context where we're required, even for probable cause. Let's say that Jack calls our office and says, my brother died in this hospital and I'm concerned about it. Even in the statement that I write up, first of all, no one can access that unless potentially it's challenged in court, then the court can look at it. But even if the court were to look at it, I believe I could write there, family member of a person with a disability in X facility. So that's the main thing. I know for me, because I do work a lot in facilities and I often hear from folks and I just tell them my default is to use discretion. And I'm very well practiced at approaching, whoever, administrators, lawmakers, whoever, and saying, I've heard that X is a problem. I think it helps to have some presence there because they know I talk to a lot of different people. So it's not like, oh, I only meet with John, so he must have told me. But it's definitely, I think a lot of the onus is just on us to just be diligent in doing that. And sometimes it does mean deciding, am I gonna maybe get a less effective outcome because I'm not going to tell them who the person was. I'm not going to tell them what day it happened. I'm just going to tell them it's a problem. And depending on the circumstances, it could go either way, but generally without the person's consent, we wouldn't. The one sort of exception I can think of to that is in investigations. The interesting thing about our investigations is that what we learn is confidential. It can't be shared with anyone except the agency that gave us the information. So in that way, because we're requesting the records, I have to request the records of Jack's brother. So they're going to know I'm looking at Jack's brother. And it's an interesting sort of tension in that it can be frustrating for loved ones and family members, and it can be hard for us. It's hard to look at something and say, oh my gosh, these people were right. Their loved one was neglected, and not be able to tell them that. But the benefit of it is that we tell the facility as well, like we can release some information publicly, but it has to be de-identified. And so for the most part, we tell them, the purpose of me doing this is so that I can talk to you honestly about what happened. So in that situation, but those usually, again, even if it came from staff, they'd know what we were looking at, but they wouldn't have to know why.
And I would say a lot of that is, Megan kind of alluded to this, but there are certain facilities where like everyone knows Megan. Megan's like kind of like a rock star. And it is a result of kind of our monitoring efforts where we built up relationships of trust with facilities and the people that are in them and the people that work there. And that relationship of trust, I think, gives people comfort and security in reporting to us. And so, that is a sign of a job well done is when facilities understand who we are and understand how we can be utilized. And it's not just the facilities that Megan goes into. We just use Meg as an example because she is treated like a rock star at some places. But, there are plenty of facilities across the state that, put up our posters about like, this is the organization you can call if you have a problem and here's what they do. And those relationships of trust are, maybe not legal protections, but a level of protection that people feel when they reach out to us.
In Colorado, are there any specific concerns that Disability Law Colorado is looking at, let's say with facilities, with maybe the due process considerations for people being detained in facilities? Or is there anything like specific to Colorado or that DLC is looking at specifically now?
I'm going to do something that is maybe not that common here, but which I do fairly often, which is to say, especially in talking to people in other states, I think that we are proud to say that Colorado has made a lot of progress in a lot of areas. And so I did an interview not long ago with someone looking at comparative circumstance, was asking me questions like, well, I can't even remember, but it was types of abuse that like we don't see here. And so that is a great thing. And I think a sign, as Jack was saying, of all the work that our state has put into this. Having said that, there certainly are issues. I think that the overwhelming issue that comes to mind for me, though, really is a lack of, I don't want to say facilities because treatment and all of that is way beyond facilities. We have a lack of housing. We have a lack of community-based programming. We have a lack of continuity of care and transition planning. And some of that relates to the quality, in a facility or whether people's rights are being respected, but so much of it is just that we lack the infrastructure. We have all kinds of money and all kinds of designs, and on paper we have a very robust behavioral health system, but in actuality, we have a system where more often than not, or as often, I mean, people call a few hospitals, no one has any beds, and so they end up calling the police and saying, hey, my friend, neighbor, son, brother, sister, is trespassing, and then that person goes to jail. One of the main things that we've worked on for the last decade in Colorado that's as relevant today as it was when it was first filed is we have a lawsuit with the state about people that are in jail awaiting beds for competency restoration, which is pretty common. I mean, most states at this point have this problem, and it's the sort of obvious but unintended consequence of not having sufficient mental health resources. And then sort of this reaction of people get caught up in the criminal legal system. So now we're saying to ourselves, oh, well, we need to invest more in services in the criminal legal system. And so, at least in Colorado, I mean, the only path to a state hospital bed, the 96% of the time, is through the criminal court. And then we have people in the state hospital. This goes more to your original question. We still deal with a lot of concerns about just sort of a lack of treatment and warehousing, and just sort of a lack of respect for lack of recognition of how much of an infringement it is on someone's life and their rights. I hear all the time, oh, well, he'll only be here 6 more months, or, well, we're going to do that at the next review, in next quarter. And just these assumptions that, some people's time is not as valuable. Their life needs, choices, jobs, futures. And so it's this weird tension of like resources we have that are sometimes misused, and then a lack of we have people who need the resources and resources that are not being utilized in the best way possible. So, for me, I think a lot of what I do is working on this just disentanglement of behavioral health and the criminal legal system, and really pushing people to realize that, there are certainly other people with this messaging, but like if we do not create something upstream, people will float downstream. And the more that you incentivize that by saying, oh, look, we've built yet another program for justice involved people, it just increases the problem. And so that's an issue that I think for us and for other states is just really entrenched. And in the last month, our state's wait list has gone from better to worse again. We have more people on the wait list today than we did when we filed the lawsuit. And no real easily identified solutions for increasing access to services or supportive housing or independent housing or any of the things that we know are necessary.
Is that connected to the pandemic, or was this something that was happening long before and just continues to get worse?
Both. Yeah, it was happening before. During the pandemic, it did get worse, but then it got better again. So it ebbs and flows, and it's not always easy to identify why, other than in general, we know that more people are being referred for competence. So more people are being identified as potentially incompetent, and then more people are being found incompetent. So the pandemic definitely had an impact, but even after we sort of got over that hump, a couple months ago, the state was projecting being in compliance by the summer, by the end of this year. I mean, compliance for us in our lawsuit means people are admitted by agreed upon timelines, which are 21 days at most, depending on your acuity and your needs. And so they projected having less than 100 people on the wait list and being able to admit everyone timely. And now there's 465 people on the wait list, and we're back to, all across the state, people sitting in jails waiting for treatment. And the concerning thing too is that the treatment is not really, I mean, they do go to a psychiatric hospital, so it is treatment, but the focus is restoration of competency to be prosecuted and proceed in your criminal case. So you do receive psychiatric care, but it's not the kind of intensive wraparound behavioral health care that's really what folks would, a lot of these folks would benefit from.
Yeah, I think maybe in the general public, these words capacity and competency get thrown around a lot. But when you're talking about competency, you're basically talking about someone going through the criminal justice system. Maybe it's their attorney, maybe it's the prosecutor, maybe it's the judge. Someone has identified, I don't think this person understands what they're going through, or what I don't think they can assist their counsel in defending them. And that's the restoration, that at least at the
Exactly,
very
yeah.
right.
It's that, and it has no significance outside of a criminal courtroom.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So with community services, I mean, I think all this goes back to you want robust, comprehensive, compassionate, accessible community services to prevent anyone from ever being in a situation where they have to be in a facility or have to be in a situation that needs this kind of monitoring. How do you how do you reinforce or build up those community resources? How do you make sure that that improvement is happening?
It is tough, and I think that it is hard because we get lots of people who need our help right now. Like in a fiscal year, we get upwards of 4,000 people contacting us for help in lots of different areas. And so that's why we've turned to this more systemic focus to address the systems long term, which we do through various tools in our toolbox, including class action lawsuits. We had a class action lawsuit settle recently for kids with mental health disabilities that needed intensive services under Medicaid. That's now has a robust implementation plan that's being developed to try to change how the system is working in Colorado for kids. But we've also used tactics like filing complaints with the Department of Justice, and then they've come in and sued the state to try to push for more community services and resources to get people out of nursing homes, because we know a lot of people with disabilities across the board get warehoused in nursing homes in the state. So we really try to find big strategies to push systems change. The other thing is, Megan mentioned the being chained to a bed, and we did an investigation using our authority and monitored the facility multiple times and issued a public report and then legislated around the issue, and did media around the issue. So we really kind of came at it from all angles, and they no longer use metal chains in that facility. So there's a lot of like big picture thinking and strategizing around where can we actually make an impact, recognizing that it's not going to change things for people tomorrow, which frankly is not like we don't love that. But with the resources and the staff that we have, that's kind of where we feel that we can make the biggest impact.
For the person going through a process that might be dehumanizing, you it's urgent and it is hard to communicate exactly how much of a moral injury it can be to have your liberty taken away for a day or 2 days or whatever. Um, but I think there is a degree of comfort, at least for me, having gone through facilities, knowing that there are people with the capacity and the obligation and the mandate to stay on top of things, to stay aware of things. And maybe my voice, my complaint doesn't see immediate action right now, but from what you're sounds like from what you're saying is all of these little points of connection, all of these little points, while it's important to validate someone in the immediacy when they do contact you, all of these little things are accumulating. All of these little things become the sort of tools in your toolbox to find probable cause, to launch a larger investigation, to seek class action lawsuit. So, I mean, with that in mind, um, what would you say to someone who is in Colorado right now and does have concerns and doesn't know where to go to? Maybe they know someone in a nursing home, or maybe they themselves is having some interaction with a jail where they're not getting the medications met. What would you suggest, or what would you say to that person who is feeling like the system is taking something from them, they think it's wrong, and they don't know who to turn to.
I mean, the main thing that comes to mind to me is just to not be silent. I could say reach out to us, and I mean that. I mean, but the reality is we may not be the most appropriate, or we may not be able to provide that level of support. But I think, you have to tell your story, and you have to reach out, because you never know. There may be 10 people that call us that it's sort of a blip on the radar. We track everything, but this happened actually just recently. I had somebody that had been in a jail, and I read it, and I said, you know what? I'm tired of this. And so I'm like, I'm going to get her records, and I'm going to go talk to this jail. And I know I can extrapolate that into larger conversations. I work a lot actually with jails and served on the Jail Standards Commission. So, A, no one will know your story if you don't tell it. B, you never know when someone might be responsive. You also never know when your story may be useful. One of, I think, maybe the most rewarding thing for me in this job so far is a couple of years ago, 2 years in a row, I worked on legislation that was driven entirely by clients' stories. And I was able to find clients who had since been released from the facilities, whether it was prison or a psychiatric hospital. And they came in person and testified at the state capitol about their experience. And even though it was 2 or 3 years after that point of crisis, and even though, it certainly didn't change anything for them about the harm that was done, I also see just the, there's so much power in having your story elevated. And so, you just never know who's listening, and how your story might help someone else, or when it might help someone else.
As we wrap up the interview, is there anything else you want to say about protection and advocacy organizations broadly, or DLC specifically, anything you want people to know?
I would just say that the disability community is one that people can join at any time. We don't discriminate. So people often think, well, I don't have a disability and this doesn't affect me, but you could acquire a disability tomorrow. You could have a child that has a disability. You could have another family member who acquires a disability. So even though we shouldn't have to make this personal to make people care, it can quickly become personal for anyone. So the disability community does not discriminate, and you can join us at any time. So it should matter to everyone.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I would just encourage people. I think protection and advocacy agencies are definitely underutilized in many ways, and not enough people know about. So I think for sure, and again, because they all operate so differently, don't hesitate to reach out to the P&A in your state. Whether it's you have an idea about a bill that you'd like to see passed, or you had a negative experience, during a hospitalization, whatever it is. And the worst that can happen is, they may say, sorry, we can't help you. But I really appreciate this opportunity, because it's really helpful for us to be able to educate people and inform people about what we do, especially because there is one in every state. So even if you're not in Colorado, this is totally relevant to you.